All right, coming to you live here at Kubecon in Chicago. This is Barton George. I'm here with the one, the only Jim Zemlin, Executive Director of the Linux Foundation. Jim, how are you doing?
Very good. Thank you for having me, Barton.
A little closer to the microphone. We want to hear your dulcet tones loud and clear.
Thank you for having me, Barton.
Okay, you got your NPR voice.
This is my voice.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So, my gosh, we have met a long time ago.
Yeah.
I think back when I was at another company, and then also you had just taken over the Linux Foundation. Tell me the story of how the two groups came together.
Yeah. So I was.
What year was this?
This was back. So I'm hitting my 20th anniversary. If you can believe it.
Holy
at the
schmoly.
Linux Foundation. Yeah. I had left a startup, and that the company got sold, and I was working with some open source people and got introduced to an organization called the Free Standards Group. At the time, the goal of that organization was to help promote a standardized Linux ABI, essentially a consistent way across Linux distributions to build an application ecosystem. And
So what was it? So before this, I know you've told me before, but your background is...
I was an entrepreneur, basically. I worked at a couple of startups, one called Choreo, where we were one of the original software as a service companies, but we called them application service providers at the time. That company went public in the summer of 2000, which was great, but unfortunately it went public in the summer of 2000, which was not great in the end.
Nope.
And then I went on and worked at another startup that was related to open source called Covalent Technology. This was a group of Apache Software Foundation folks who had gotten together to build a commercial company around open source technology. And like Choreo being a little too soon to the software as a service world, Covalent was. We had a decent outcome, but it wasn't the same kind of outcome you see in a lot of the open source software companies today. But as a result of that, I got interested in open source, met up with folks in the open source community, and after Covalent wound down, I decided a while I would go try working in this world. At about the same time, there was an organization called OSDL that was working to promote Linux, Open Source Development Lab.
Okay, it sounds familiar, yes.
And this was an organization where they were trying to not only promote the Linux platform, but to provide high-end hardware resources to open source developers in order to improve the Linux kernel project in particular, but also Linux distributions, largely.
What was their relationship with the Free Software Foundation? Was there a lot of tension between it? Did they work? Did they play together nicely? Or was
I don't know that they had much of any relationship with the Free Software Foundation. I was running a group called the Free Standards Group, which was different. But I don't actually know the answer to that question. But at any rate, my task was to roll up these organizations into a single company, which we named the Linux Foundation.
Okay.
I think that was in 2006. We may have announced it in 2007. It was like towards the end or the beginning of that time. I don't remember the specific dates, but and I've been there ever since.
Wait, 2006? I'm doing
So
the math.
2004, Free Standards
Okay.
Group, which was a predecessor organization, but same company. We rolled up these other companies, and now it's going to be 2024 in a couple of months.
So people think of Linux Foundation, and as it started out, it was all about Linux, right? It was about the kernel. It was about Linus Torvalds.
Yeah.
And yet it's kind of expanded since then.
Sure.
So where did you or somebody else smarter than you get the idea of, I'm just joking, get the idea of, hey, we could probably expand. Why don't we take this under our wing? Or it would be good if we expanded that. And did it just happen by design or default or?
Yeah, obviously this came from smarter people than me. I appreciate the support. I think that it's funny, the first job I really had was to make sure that the Linux platform was a ubiquitous part of computing, right? The job was go and create an ecosystem around Linux, largely in enterprise software, server-side software. And so I spent most of my time criticizing Microsoft, talking about how much better Linux was. Although, and I know you worked at Sun Microsystems, we didn't really want to necessarily or think that we could kill Microsoft. We were trying to create the perception of a two-horse race between Microsoft and Linux in order to kill Sun.
Yes, I remember you were when we did our first podcast, you came after me and in quite a way when I was at Sun.
But the reason for that is that Linux was really consolidating the Unix space. That was the primary competition because you could move a Unix workload over to Linux much easier than you would ever be able to build something that, bring something over that was running on Windows.
Yeah, I mean, I tell this story, but I remember at Sun when I was in one of the marketing groups, we had someone from software strategy come in, present on Linux, and my jaw dropped. I just thought, why are we not terrified of this? Why do we not see that we are in big trouble here? For all the reasons that you said, and needless to say, that was one of the things they missed, and to the detriment of Sun.
Yeah, no, I think if there is a theory that if Sun had open sourced Solaris sooner and had leaned into that technology in a different way, that Linux wouldn't be the success that it is today. But my job at the time was really to go win that market, and it was so fun to make fun of Microsoft, and they certainly helped us out with all their fear mongering of Linux. But we weren't really thinking that we would kill.
Was that when Ballmer was talking about Linux as a cancer? Was that?
Yeah, it was great. I mean, he just
gives you free
played
publicity.
the David versus Goliath part so well. He was the Goliath to our David, and what people didn't realize is we were really going after those Unix workloads by creating this inevitability around Linux as the alternative to the proprietary Microsoft Windows, which was the part that Microsoft played so well. What's crazy is, now all these years later, Microsoft is one of the most prolific contributors to open source. They've based a huge part of their business on open source technology and completely transformed themselves.
No, and then you talk about people who need to make a turn strategically, whereas some of the companies didn't do that or did it too little, too late.
Yeah.
Other ones have jumped on the bandwagon, and I think when they've come a bit late to the party, they have the resources to put behind it that they can play catch up pretty quickly, as they've shown.
Yeah.
So you're out there trying to kill Sun, and you're focusing on the.
So we were pretty successful in making Linux this important part of the computing world, and Linus and the kernel community were incredibly successful in building one of the largest developer ecosystems in the world. And what we realized is if we can bring the knowledge of how we've built communities successfully with Linux and how we've been able to build de facto open source standards, create net new markets to other forms of technology, that this could be a new way for collaborative innovation to happen and to accelerate business outcomes, society impact, and so forth. And so we started hosting new projects, new open source projects in new markets.
Was there one in particular that you took on first?
There was, and we thought about it in a pretty specific way. One of the ways you can think about the early days of the Linux Foundation, to some degree now, is almost like a reverse venture capitalist, where you're trying to understand
try to find investments that suck and put you out of business.
No, trying to find opportunity where big markets are changing, where they're either big markets are being disruptive or big new markets are being creative. And instead of monetizing that for value, we give it away for free in order to have impact on society and industry. And so in that sense, it's sort of like a reverse VC where you do a lot of similar things. Like, hey, what is going to be an important abstraction layer in technology? What is a new foundational disruptive technology that's coming out? At the time, software-defined networking was that movement and marketplace. Nicira had recently been sold to VMware. This was, founded by Martin Casado, who's now at Andreessen Horowitz, and the concept of SDN technology came out of Stanford University, Nick McEwen there. But we realized, hey, if there's an open source software-defined networking technology, this will be a fundamental part of computing. And at the time, there was a technology called Open Daylight that came out.
And you still have that. That's
Cisco
still a big
systems.
project.
Yeah, Open Daylight is still a huge technology that's used by telecommunications companies all over the world as their SDN controller. And it's part of a larger SDN stack that is used to run the production networks for billions of mobile device users all over the world.
So one of the things I think it's interesting is if you go back to Eric Raymond's The Cathedral and the Bazaar, he uses Linux, if I remember correctly, as the cathedral, right? It's very top down. It's open source.
Bottoms up. The cathedral.
What's the Bazaar?
Oh,
the Bazaar,
you're right. You're right.
Yeah, the Bazaar is someone like the Bazaar is the group, is the community, whereas the cathedral is more Linus on top, the benevolent dictator type model. So you were all really good at the cathedral, right? Because that's what you're used to. But yet, the way that you've expanded has been much more in the Bazaar, much more all about the community rather than having one person up there sort of dictating the.
Yeah, the cathedral and the Bazaar is such a great way to describe open source. This organic innovation that happens bottoms up, and I think that is an easy way to understand how this form of innovation happens. Where the metaphor sort of breaks down is it implies that leadership doesn't matter and that, decisions sort of happen in a much more magical way. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I mean, certainly Linus Torvalds' leadership in the Linux kernel project truly mattered.
Oh, yeah.
And he does have a very hierarchical way that he runs the Linux kernel project. And
it's been very successful, and it still is very successful.
And what he does is he doesn't have a roadmap. He applies a very light touch to his leadership. But at the end of the day, he also has brilliant taste in code and technology, and he applies that effectively in sort of this loose hierarchy that he's built up.
And he's not afraid to share his opinions. He's not a shrinking violet.
No, but he does it today in a much more soft and well-mannered way.
So I've heard. I've heard.
Yeah.
And that was GPL, I don't know, V2. I don't know if it's V3 now, but so it's...
No, it's still the same GPL V2. The license hasn't changed.
So, but now it seems like what people are doing is more the Apache type license, the more permissive. The opposite of permissive, the more business friendly, for lack of a better word, licenses. Was that a conscious effort, or you just find, because as you're saying, you're providing some structure, you're providing some help, some counsel to these people, but then they're also, they know what they're doing. And so how do they get to these other licenses?
Yeah, so I think the GPL is a restrictive license. It put restrictions on the software that requires someone who distributes software commercially to share changes that they make to that software with everybody else. And so it puts a restriction on how you can use the code. You have to share back. And that was important in the early days of Linux in order to make sure that everyone was honest about collectively improving the code base, and that worked really well. But what worked even better was just the general way that software was built in this open source distributed development model. And to some degree, the license restriction started to matter less as people realized, like, you don't even have to force me to share this stuff back. I don't want to maintain my own fork. It's too expensive to write this software and maintain it on my own. And so I want to contribute back to the commons, not because the licensing requires me to do so, but it's in my business interest to do so. And so the Apache license became very popular because it's a less restrictive license. You can kind of do whatever you want with the code. You have to give attribution to the fact that it's an Apache licensed software project. But other than that, there are a few restrictions. It also has some other patent provisions that people find useful. But the main change was from restrictive to permission to style licenses was that people sort of all got open source, and the letter of the law, so to speak, mattered a little bit less. That's not to say that either of those licenses are perfectly suitable for whatever need, but that's kind of, I think, the general trend.
It's interesting because I was involved in open source, and then I was working on some other things for a while, and I came back, and it was pretty much people were defaulting to Apache. And it was so interesting that there wasn't this religious war. I'm sure there was still to a certain extent, but it seemed like it had settled, and a lot of people say cooler heads had prevailed, or less religious, however you want to say it. So you open daylight, and then from there, what was the thing that really took it big? I mean, because you have things like Edge Foundry, I think it was, and then you've got, of course, the CNCF, which is why we're here today,
Right.
has just become huge. So what was did it grow linearly, or did...
Well, no. So, again, we'll keep going down the reverse venture capital mode. You can have a base hit or you can have a home run, right? And your company can go public and you can make gajillions of dollars, or maybe you sell it off for a little less money, but it's still good. And in this case, the home run is Kubernetes. In 2014, I was contacted by Brian Stevens, who was at the time the CTO of
Red Hat.
No,
he went
was
after
at Google.
He left Red Hat.
He left Red Hat. He was the CTO of Red Hat. He left and went to Google, and he was working there. Called me up and said, "Hey, we've got this technology. We want to get into the cloud service business, but at Google, we don't run virtual machines, which was the common way of consuming cloud services from Amazon at the time." And he said, "We will." Open source this Kubernetes technology. We're so committed to open sourcing and making an open community. We will give you this technology. We'll assign the trademark, all the copyright to the Linux Foundation.
And that's a very interesting move for Google, because for the longest time they were accused of keeping all their software to themselves. And starting with Kubernetes, they've given big deal, lots of code, very important project.
They fundamentally changed the way that cloud applications get built, deployed, and managed. And that was the goal, right? Because here's a company that never ran virtual machines in-house at all, right? They used a technology called the Borg that is essentially a container, platform, container-based platform. And the idea was, hey, in exchange for opening up this technology, putting in a neutral home, we would like to work with you to make cloud native a ubiquitous way to build and deploy applications. And that is exactly what this community has achieved. And I've been fortunate enough to be sort of a bit player in that world and set up a lot of the infrastructure for that. But really, it's the community here that's achieved just a ubiquitous new way of deploying technology. When you have this fundamental abstraction of how applications get deployed and built and managed, that's the home run in tech. So CNCF has, without question, been one of our biggest projects.
So I guess it's the first 10 years, you sort of go from Linux to Open Daylight, and then 2015, you take on Kubernetes, which is its own project, and then all of these. So it's 2015. So over the last 8 years, it's really, I don't know what the growth is, if it's a hockey stick, if it's linear, but my goodness, what are there, 830, some kind of crazy number of projects under the CNCF, which used to just be Kubernetes. Has it gone like a snowball, or how is that?
Yeah, so today we have about 1,000 projects at the Linux Foundation, ranging from horizontal technology, things like Kubernetes, the Linux kernel, software-defined networking, Node.js and server-side JavaScript, and then vertical projects. We have automotive-grade Linux, that's for the auto sector. We have Linux Foundation Energy, which is used by utility providers around the world to modernize the software in energy distribution. We have the Academy Software Foundation, which is the film industry, which open-sourced the CGI software they use to create films, and many, many more. So, we've really become an organization that enables collaborative innovation, either at sort of a horizontal technology layer or at a vertical industry layer that, has proven pretty effective. And sort of taken a world of technology where you used to build a standard and that would be something that everyone would create their technology around, to now you create a reference implementation and open source code base, and everybody builds their technology on top of that software as a faster way to innovate and have big outcomes in the tech area in particular.
So, I think what's impressive is the fact that this hasn't collapsed under its own weight, right? Because in any type of a company, when you have that much growth, it is really hard to scale. And particularly when you've got this number of projects, you need to make sure that there's the infrastructure and the processes in there to keep them going. So is that, I'm sure it's a complicated answer, but how has that happened? How is it not?
Well, again, you can, as long as you pick the right thing, you can do a lot of things wrong and still succeed. And I think the Linux Foundation, that actually comes from Martin Casada. I think the Linux Foundation is an example of that, right? Where, understanding that collaborative innovation was going to be an important new way of getting innovation outcomes early has helped us to really be successful in building these communities. In terms of supporting these communities, we've kind of, done some things really well and some things we need to improve. And, as you go from, the kernel community to a Kubernetes community to the 1,000 communities we have, you go from a couple 100,000 developers to over 1 million developers who work on this stuff every day. The thing that we're trying to work on right now is building tools and scalable systems that can provide the best possible developer experience for those developers who work on some of the most important technology in the world. It may seem like 1,000 is a small number of projects in juxtaposition of the millions of open source projects on GitHub, but these are the projects that everyone uses and must count on for our collective cybersecurity, for running almost all modern computing systems. And so we want the really important developers who work on those projects to have the best possible developer experience they can.
So then just to round off, we talked about how you've gone, about 20 years plus. Where would you like to see, just say 5 years from now, Linux Foundation? Would you want to have 2,000 projects? You want to keep it 1,000? You want to go into
that's a great question.
Ski apparel, all sorts of adjacencies?
Well, that might be a good one. So we don't measure our success based on the numbers all that much. That's a business metric that we keep track of in order to enable the more important goal, which is impact. So, as long as we're doing work, in the energy sector, as an example, that allows, RT, the French grid operator, to improve the efficiency of their power distribution in order to reduce energy loss by 50%, that's impacting climate change. I want to work on that. That's important for society. That's important for that industry. As long as we're doing that kind of work, the numbers and metrics are a little bit secondary. Having said that, you definitely have to keep your eye on, are we improving the health of these important technology artifacts? Are they being adopted in a scalable way by the industry? And to that end, we measure a lot of metrics, right? We have a whole platform that we use to look at projects and figure out, do they have good documentation? Do they have good security practices? Is their code velocity well? Has a maintainer become burned out by having to work outside of normal hours all the time because their employer won't give them enough time during the day? And we use those metrics to facilitate, again, that great developer experience that gets great technology, that's adopted by the market, that creates the impact that really is how we measure our success.
That's pretty cool. Well, I think Jim Zemlin, I give you a lot of flack, but I'm pretty impressed with you. I'm impressed what you've done over how lucky you've gotten. I mean, how well you have stewarded this project from one cathedral to a big bazaar.
Well, it's, as I like to say, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good.
And with that, this is Barton George and Jim Zemlin saying good night from Chicago and Kubecon 2023.
Good night, everybody.